This is why the government seems to think that CMMC is not that big of a deal. They think that you've already implemented all of these controls and are compliant and just have to meet the assessment criteria. As we know, that is likely not the case for a lot of defense contractors and their supply chain because it is complex. We're kicking off the new year with everyone's favorite subject, CMMC. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another great episode of Hive Live. I'm Katie Dodson, and we're kicking off the new year with everyone's favorite subject, CMMC. Hopefully, you've been following all of our great approachable cybersecurity content on social media, but if you haven't, you can find us on all the major channels at Hive Systems. Make sure to give us a follow and subscribe. If you've been following along with the CMMC journey over the last several years, then you know it is finally here. The CMMC program is in effect as of mid-December 2024, and defense contractors and their security providers alike are now eligible to achieve certification through a C3PAO. But we'll get into more of that later in this episode. As I mentioned before, my name is Katie Dodson. I am president of Hive Systems Defense Solutions, our division of Hive Systems that is solely dedicated to supporting our DIB clients as we navigate CMMC together. I am a Lead Certified CMMC Assessor, so I have been following along closely with the evolution of the CMMC program. But fear not, rather than having to go read all 400-something pages of the final rule, I'm going to break down everything you need to know today so that you can stay compliant. So let's get started with the basics. This is the overall timeline of CMMC. So you can see it's been about 14 years in the making, starting all the way back in November 2010 with Executive Order 13556, which describes the requirements for protecting what is now known as controlled unclassified information. Back in December 2017, that was the deadline to implement all of the NIST 800-171 Revision 2 controls. This is why the government seems to think that CMMC is not that big of a deal. They think that you've already implemented all of these controls and are compliant and just have to meet the assessment criteria. As we know, that is likely not the case for a lot of defense contractors and their supply chain because it is complex and a lot of controls to implement to meet the NIST 800-171 requirements. The CMMC 1.0 was introduced in September of 2020. That came along with several new DFARS clauses, 7019, 7020, and 7021, which all describe the requirements for maintaining and accurately reporting your assessment score in the supplier performance risk system, flowing down those requirements to your supply chain and subcontractors, and maintaining a correct level of CMMC compliance for the contracts that you are trying to win, basically. So what those all boil down to is you're going to perform an assessment, it's going to be accurate, you're going to report it, and you're going to maintain that level for the duration of the contract and renew it every 3 years. Then in March 2021, there was an internal review of CMMC 1.0 because, surprise, everyone found it very, very confusing. There was a lot of gray area in CMMC 1.0. There were a lot of conflicting requirements about self-assessments versus third-party assessments, and the requirements in place for the controls were all kind of all over the place. So they actually went ahead and made the changes based on the feedback that came from the public. So in November of 2021, CMMC 2.0 was announced. Since then, the CMMC program 2.0 has gone through a lot of public comments and review periods, and it went through a lot of revisions as well before finally being implemented in December of 2024, when it is officially in effect. So as of right now, CMMC program itself is in effect on a voluntary basis. There is still another part of the rulemaking process that needs to go through and be approved before it is official in a mandatory perspective, but you are eligible to go ahead and start getting your CMMC compliance assessments now. So the current requirements, if you have federal contract information, you're going to have to meet FAR 52204-21 that's already in your contracts. And if you're going to be dealing with controlled unclassified information, you're going to follow DFARS 252-204-7012. So as I said before, the new requirements under the CMMC program are actually checking the compliance with the existing requirements that are in place. There are going to be some enhanced requirements where applicable at CMMC level 3, which we'll get into on the next slide. And you have to be compliant with the specific CMMC level in the solicitation to even be eligible for contract awards moving forward. So there's some pretty heavy implications for not being CMMC compliant if you want to continue to win DoD contracts. So as I said before, 1.0 to 2.0 changed a lot. 1.0 had 5 different levels. The practices that were in place were from all, I like pick and choose from all kinds of different compliance frameworks. It wasn't really streamlined. And these transition levels didn't need third-party assessments, even though level 4 is higher than level 3. Lots of confusing levels and requirements there. Moving into 2.0, they've streamlined it into 3 different levels, which actually are no longer called foundational, advanced, and expert, but are just level 1, level 2, and level 3. So level 1 is 17 practices. You have to meet the same requirements that are already established in the FAR clause that I mentioned on the previous slide. FAR clause has 15 requirements. They just broke one of those out into multiple. So that's why it's 17 here. And you have to do that on a self-assessment basis every year. So basically, you're going to go look and make sure that your scope has implemented those 17 controls. You are going to attest to that and say, yes, we are meeting all these controls, and you're going to do that on an annual basis. Moving up to level 2, they've aligned the requirements with NIST 800-171, so the controls that you are supposed to already have implemented. There are 110 controls with revision 2, and you are required to do either a self-assessment or a C3PAO assessment every 3 years. The specific requirement for self versus third-party assessment is going to be explicitly stated in the solicitation so that you know whether or not you need to go get that third-party C3PAO assessment. And then the last level is level 3. So there are more than 110 controls here because basically you do your level 2 and then you tack on 24 more controls from NIST SP 800-172. So that particular set of controls is mostly focused on protecting the information from advanced persistent threats. So these are generally going to be the higher sensitivity level controlled and classified information. And those are also going to be performed every 3 years, but by DIBCAC. So you will get your level 2 assessment first with a C3PAO. If you have to meet level 3, there is no self-assessment option. You have to go through a C3PAO. And once that is complete, you can go ahead and schedule the level 3 assessment with DIBCAC. So who does CMMC apply to? As I mentioned before, if you have federal contract information or controlled unclassified information that you process, store, or transmit, this applies to you. It does not apply if you are operating a government system on behalf of the government, but if that information is leaving the government and coming into a non-government organization, CMMC applies. The applicable CMMC level and assessment requirements will be explicitly stated in the solicitation, so you know exactly what you have to meet in order to obtain that contract or possibly win that contract. But if you don't meet it, or if at any point your contract, you no longer meet the requirements of that contract, you could be in trouble, you could lose potential contracts, or you could be completely ineligible to win them. If you are using a third-party external service provider, there are some implications for them as well. So if you are using a cloud service provider for your environment that processes, stores, and transmits CUI, then that CSP has to be FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. So they better be on the FedRAMP marketplace as moderate or higher, or they need to provide you with a body of evidence so that you can check and make sure that they are implementing all the controls that are included in the FedRAMP moderate baseline before you can use them in your environment. If you use a cloud service provider that is not equivalent to FedRAMP moderate, you will not pass a CMMC level 2 assessment for CUI. If you have external service providers that are not cloud service providers, but they provide IT or cybersecurity services, those external service providers are now going to be brought into your assessment scope. So what that means is if you have a MSSP, or if you are using a SIM that has a cloud behind it that's going to be touching CUI, things like that, they are now going to be part of your assessment. If they are performing certain controls, they need to provide evidence for those controls, and you need to be validating that they have implemented the appropriate security for the controls that they are doing for your environment. And then there's also some flow down requirements here. So if subcontractors are going to touch federal contract information in performance of the contract, then they need to be CMMC level 1 compliant as well. It is on you to make sure that your subcontractors are doing what they need to do for level 1, which is a self-assessment and uploading to SPURS. You can ask them to provide you a copy of what is uploaded to SPURS, but you will not have access to their entry in SPURS. Only the DoD has access to SPURS to see multiple companies. If your subcontractors are going to touch CUI, then there is probably one of two options here. If you only have to do a self-assessment, they only have to do a self-assessment. If you need to be certified by a third party to be eligible for the contract award, then they also need to be certified. So you need to make sure that your subcontractors are going out and doing the assessments they're required to do, or are hiring the third parties to do it. And on top of that, it kind of gives you more burden of figuring out whether or not you do need to flow down CUI or FCI to those subcontractors. If they can perform the work without getting the FCI or the CUI, then they don't have to meet the CMMC requirements. And that might make things a lot easier on your supply chain and also help protect CUI and FCI moving forward. So as I mentioned before, there are multiple federal rules involved with CMMC. 32 CFR Part 170 is the CMMC program rule. That's the one that talks about what the different levels are, what the different assessment types are, the use of POAMs, and what the assessment process looks like. And that is the one that is finalized and effective as of December 16th. But as I mentioned before, right now CMMC is in place on a voluntary basis because only one of the two parts is effective. 48 CFR Part 204 is still open. They went to final comment period back in October, so it is currently under review. And once it gets past the review period, which we expect to happen in early 2025, it will become effective about 60 days later and describes how CMMC will be enforced in DoD contracts. At that point, you will start seeing the mandatory CMMC program requirements show up in new solicitations. So what does the implementation plan look like? So, as I mentioned, once the second part of the rulemaking process is in effect and CMMC is official, the first phase is going to kick off. And what that looks like is all of your level 1 requirements are going to start showing up in contracts, and some level 2 self-assessment requirements are going to start showing up as well. And that will be a condition of contract award. If you see a solicitation and you do not meet the minimum requirement, you may as well not even submit a proposal because you will just be thrown in the do not award stack over at the DoD. So then 1 year later, so let's just say this all starts in March of 2025. Come March 2026, we're looking at the second phase, where you'll start seeing level 2 certification assessments popping up in the solicitations. This means you're going to have to go and get that C3PAO assessment, preferably before that March of 2026 date, because there's only a handful of C3PAOs available in the marketplace to perform these assessments, and their schedules are booking up pretty quick. So if you know you're going to have to meet level 2 certification assessment requirements down the road for your CUI, you may as well start planning for it now, implementing the controls, and getting on the books with a C3PAO this calendar year. And then 1 year after that, we're getting into the final phase, essentially, where level 3 is going to start popping up in those contracts. So you have to have your level 2 C3PAO assessment complete already, and then go and get your level 3 DIBCAC assessment in order to be eligible for these contract awards. And then once that's done, everything is official. Every single new solicitation, every option year that's up for renewal, all of those are going to start having a CMMC level requirement. And you're basically going to phase out any contracts that no longer have a CMMC level. So through those option years, we're going to phase in requirements for every single DoD contract that either exists before CMMC or after CMMC. So this is just another view of the exact same multi-phase plan. It talks more about what the actual requirements are. So in phase 1, I mentioned before, that's level 1. Those are your 15 FAR requirements, your level 2 self-assessments, which are the 110 NIST controls. You do have to upload the results to SPRS, and the self-assessments for level 2 are every 3 years, but you still have to affirm every year. So you basically need to have a senior level official who's responsible for compliance and security in your organization, who then goes into SPRS every single year and says, we are still compliant with the score that we said in the previous year. If they falsely represent your compliance, they can be fined under the False Claims Act. I think it's about $10,000 per control that you've misrepresented, and could also face jail time. So there's a lot of responsibility put on that individual, but they're also going to make sure that you actually are compliant before putting their name in SPRS. So it's important to be thorough with these assessments and collect the evidence that you need to prove that you're actually meeting the requirements. For level 2, you are allowed to have some POAMs for certain controls. We'll get into that a little bit later, but you do have to remediate all of them within 180 days. Basically, if you do your assessment, have POAMs, and more than 180 days later, those POAMs are still open, your initial assessment lapses, and you have to completely start over your assessment. You no longer have a conditional CMMC status at that point. Then in phase 2, that's where you're going to start seeing those C3PAO assessments coming into play. It's the same requirements as the self-assessments for level 2. It's every 3 years. You have to annually affirm in SPRS that the score is still accurate and compliant, and you are allowed to have some POAMs as long as they are closed within 180 days. The only difference here is that the C3PAO will upload the results of your assessment in the CMMC instance of EMAS, rather than you going in and manually implementing them in SPRS. And then the final phase there is the level 3. So that's your 110 plus 24, NIST 800, 172 controls, DoD assessment every 3 years, and they will upload the results to EMAS, and you do have to annually affirm in SPRS. All right, so now that we've kind of got the high-level basics under control, let's get into the terminology, because CMMC introduced some new terms for their program that do not align necessarily with existing terminology in industry. So the basics. I mentioned previously, the affirming official is going to be a senior official at your company. They usually are someone who's responsible for security and compliance, and they are the ones who have to go into SPRS every year and put their name down as saying that the score is accurate. If it is found to be misrepresented, they are liable under the False Claims Act. An organization seeking assessment is any company that's trying to get a CMMC status. So whether they're doing a self-assessment or a C3PAO assessment, your company is going to be called an OSA. Now, an OSC, an organization seeking certification, is specifically a company that's looking for a C3PAO or a DIBCAC assessment. It's just another term for a company that is trying to get a CMMC certification. CMMC status. So this is another area that's a little bit different. We talk about it as if it's a certification, but you're essentially going to either get a conditional certificate of CMMC status or a final certificate of CMMC status. You get a conditional certificate if you have POAMs. It turns into a final certificate once you close all of those POAMs. And then another interesting area here is how CMMC defines process, store, or transmit. So everything that's in scope for your assessment is going to be based on what processes, stores, or transmits FCI or CUI. But process, store, or transmit here includes accessing, entering, editing, generating, manipulating, or printing. So accessed is a really tricky one because it does bring more into scope than you would normally think for process, store, or transmit, because it even brings into play the individuals who are just looking at the CUI. So it's important to keep that in mind when you are scoping. Speaking of scoping, as I mentioned before, external service providers. In the scope of CMMC, an external service provider that may come into scope for your assessment is any external people, technology, or facilities used for IT or cybersecurity services. You can have other ESPs that are not for IT or cybersecurity purposes. Those are not going to come into scope because they are not truly considered an ESP under CMMC. Again, that's probably out of scope because if they still touch CUI, they're going to be in scope. So that's going to be an area where it's very important to closely follow the data flows of your CUI and FCI in your environment. Security protection assets are assets that are specifically providing security functions or capabilities for your CMMC scope. So these are your managed security service providers, your SIMs, anything that does provide that security. And those assets are processing security protection data. So it's any data that is stored or processed by those assets that is specifically used to protect your assessed environment. Some of the examples of what is considered security protection data includes configuration data that is required to operate the security asset, log files that are generated or ingested by that asset, data related to configuration or vulnerability status of in-scope assets, and passwords that grant access to the in-scope environment. Think of it this way. If a hacker or an advanced persistent threat could access that data, could they then use it to pivot and get into your environment? If so, it is probably security protection data, and that does bring those assets into scope. POAMs. So this is one of those areas where CMMC decided to do things a little differently. If you've worked with FedRAMP in the past, you've seen POAMs for things like your vulnerability scan results or temporary issues that you are working to remediate and fix. For CMMC, a POAM is specifically only used for controls that were assessed as not met. Everything on that POAM needs to be remediated within 180 days of your assessment. Now, on the flip side, an operational plan of action is exactly what I just described that we're used to seeing in FedRAMP and other environments. So those temporary deficiencies that need to be remediated. CMMC does not care if you have a remediation timeframe for those. They just want to know that they're documented in an operational plan of action and are not documented the same as the not met controls. The final rule also allowed for enduring exceptions, so they acknowledge that there are going to be special circumstances or systems that do not allow you to implement the CMMC requirements. So, for example, medical devices, test equipment, IoT, things like that. You have to document those in your SSP, but they do not need to be documented in your operational plan of action. And then finally, temporary deficiencies. Those are the things that are documented in your operational plan of action. So basically, once you have assessed your environment and you've met the controls, this pops up after that and throws something out of compliance. As long as you are documenting it somewhere in your operational plan of action, you're fine. So for example, they noted that FIPS validated cryptography that requires a patch, but then the patched version is no longer a validated version, can be considered a temporary deficiency. You just have to document it appropriately. So now that we've gotten through the terminology, let's get into the deep dive. Let's get into every single level and what it entails. So level one. Level one protects federal contract information. And if you are not sure what federal contract information is, we just did a Hive Live about that last month in December. So go check that out. Andrew and I really dive into more specifics about what is FCI. And we do also have an ACT post out that we posted in December that dives into this in more detail as well. The controls are all derived from FAR 52204-21. So there are 15 controls in there. For CMMC, they split some of those into multiple controls for a total of 17, but you're ultimately still implementing the same 15 controls in the FAR clause. At level one, you have to self-assess annually. So every year you're expected to go make sure that those 17 controls are still in place and operating effectively on your scope. So anywhere that your FCI flows. And you do need to follow the level one assessment guide for that. That is available on CIO's website. It talks about the different assessment methods that you can use, gives some examples of documentation you can look at or interview questions and things of that nature to kind of help walk you through what they're trying to get at for that control so that you can assess it appropriately. The assets that are in scope are any that process, store, or transmit FCI. So if it touches FCI, it's in scope. And if it does not touch FCI, it is out of scope, with the exception of those specialized assets that I mentioned before. So those assets that cannot have the NIST controls implemented on them, cannot have the FAR controls implemented on them, are going to be out of scope. Your Internet of Things, your government furnished equipment, your test equipment. There are no POAMs at level one. You have to be compliant with all 17 controls with no POAMs before you upload it to SPURS. If you upload a score to SPURS and you have outstanding POAMs, you can get yourself in trouble under that False Claims Act. Now, what you're putting into SPURS is your senior official's attestation, and then the actual details of your self-assessment. So level 1, your date and scope, your cage codes, and your compliance results. This is important to note about SPURS. Everything is required to be implemented in SPURS. To have a SPURS account, you need a cage code. So if you do not have a cage code, most defense contractors do, but the external service providers might not, then you need to go register in sam.gov for a cage code so that you can then get your SPURS account. There's a multi-level process to getting that account. I had to go through it myself. So once you have your cage code from sam.gov, you can go apply through PIE, P-I-E-E. They will set up your vendor cyber role in their system that will then allow you to get access to SPURS. So if you're having trouble registering, feel free to reach out to Hive Systems. We can help walk you through that. We've been through it ourselves, but there's also some detailed guidance available on the PIE website for how to actually get an account in PIE so that you can get your SPURS account. So if you're using a cloud service provider that touches the FCI, they should also be meeting those level 1 requirements. You should probably validate that with your CSP. And same thing with your external service providers. If they are touching FCI by providing a security function for you, an IT function for you, then you should be validating that they are meeting the level 1 requirements for these security functions that they are providing for you. There's no C3PAO assessment or DIBCAC assessment at level 1. And you can get a third party to do your self-assessment, but it will still be considered a self-assessment for the purposes of CMMC. Even if you had a C3PAO do your level 1 assessment, then you're just basically overpaying for an assessment because it's still considered a self-assessment and not a certification assessment. Certification assessments do not come into play until level 2 and level 3. So these are the number of controls implemented at level 1. This will make sense in a couple slides why there's a couple that have nothing here, but you have 4 access control controls. You've got 2 for identification and authentication, 1 for media protection, which is focused on media sanitization, 4 under physical protection, 2 for system and communications protection, and 4 for system and information integrity. So those are the total number of controls you're looking at here for level 1. Getting into level 2. Level 2 is a bit more complicated. This is where your controlled and classified information comes into play, and you have to meet the NIST 800-171 controls. Right now, the CMMC rule is written to specifically note that you are meeting Rev 2. Rev 3 exists, but there is no assessment methodology available for for revision 2, revision 3. So you have to do revision 2 right now. But if you're interested in knowing what you will have to implement when Rev 3 is in place, then we do have some SSP templates available for free on our website for both level 2 and level 3. The level 3 controls are going to more closely mirror the actual NIST 800-171 controls. So they're going to have parameters, they're going to have subparts, there's going to be a lot more to it than just single sentence control statements. And you could probably take a look at that to see where you need to navigate to moving forward. But I don't expect that to really come into play in CMMC for at least 2 or 3 years. For now, they're going to stick with Rev 2 just because that's what exists. The assessment requirements for level 2 have to happen every 3 years, whether you're doing a self-assessment or a C3PAO assessment. Your contract solicitation is going to state whether it's a self or a C3PAO assessment, and you will follow the NIST 800-171A assessment criteria and DoD scoring methodology. So again, these are available on the DoD CIO website. If you're going to be doing your self-assessment, your C3PAO is going to follow that process as well if they're doing your assessment. What's in scope here are those assets that process, store, or transmit CUI and those security protection assets that we previously talked about. So any of those assets that are performing a security function for your environment, or any protection asset that is processing security data that could be used to compromise your environment. Not in scope or classified assets. CMMC does not apply to classified systems. It's only for unclassified systems. Contractor risk managed assets are not in scope. So CRMAs, to get into that a little bit more, a contractor risk managed asset is an asset that could process, store, or transmit CUI, but because of the controls or policies you have in place, it is not supposed to. So what you do for those controls is you document them thoroughly in your SSP, but they will not be assessed as part of your assessment unless there are some questions that are brought up from your documentation. Any sort of red flags that go up about those assets. Otherwise, you just have to document them appropriately. Specialized assets are also not in scope, so they need to be documented in your SSP, but they will not be assessed. And any assets that cannot store, process, or transmit CUI are also not in scope. Level 2 is the first place that we see POAMs come into play. So there are certain controls where POAMs are allowed. The DoD scoring methodology assigns a 1, a 3, or a 5 to each of the controls. If it's a 3 or a 5 and it's considered a more important control, you cannot POAM it. There are, I believe, 44 controls that could have POAMs, and you have to obtain a score of 80% or higher in order to still get that conditional certification. So it does allow you to have quite a few POAMs of those one-pointers, but you have to make sure that you don't drop below a score of 88 out of 110. You do have to do a POAM closeout assessment as well. So what's going to happen is if you do have POAMs and you have higher than an 80%, you will get a conditional certificate of CMMC status at level 2 in SPRS. Your C3PAO, if they perform your assessment, will actually give you a certificate that says you have a conditional certificate. Then, within 180 days, you have to close all of those POAMs and have a C3PAO come back and assess that they have actually been closed. You can use the same C3PAO that you used for your assessment, or you can go to somebody else if you'd like to work with a different C3PAO. But if they find that your POAMs are still open, even if it's just one single POAM, your conditional certificate lapses and you have to do the entire process again. So it's really important to make sure that you truly are ready for a C3PAO assessment before you get into that scheduled kickoff with your C3PAO. So for SPRS, if you're doing a self-assessment, it's all the same information that you did for level 1. So your cage code, your compliance results, your assessment dates, your cage codes. If you had any POAMs and things like that. If you do your assessment through a C3PAO, all of that information is going to automatically populate from CMMC EMAS, and the only thing that you have to do is have your senior official go in and attest annually. So even though the assessment's every 3 years, they need to go in and annually affirm. And if they've already affirmed for that year and then you have your assessment, they still need to go in and affirm again when that assessment is done. And then if you have a POAM closeout assessment, they need to go in and affirm again when that POAM closeout assessment is done. So they just need to make sure that every time the status changes or every year that they need to go in and affirm that score. If you're using a cloud service provider that touches CUI in any way, it needs to be FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. As I mentioned before, the burden of proof is on you to make sure that they are actually equivalent to FedRAMP moderate if they're not in the FedRAMP marketplace. So you should be getting a customer responsibility matrix and a body of evidence from your cloud service provider that shows what they are doing for each of the FedRAMP moderate baseline controls so that you can validate that they actually are compliant before you use them in your environment. If you're using an external service provider that's not a cloud service provider, you also need to get a customer responsibility matrix from them and thoroughly document in your SSP what they do versus what you do for those controls, and they will need to be part of your assessment scope. So if you have a C3PAO assessment, you're going to want representatives from that external service provider actually sitting in your interviews and providing evidence. The only way around that is if your external service provider voluntarily goes and gets a level 2 assessment themselves with a C3PAO, in which case they can hand you proof of their certification, and that will be sufficient for your assessor. If you get a C3PAO assessment, or if you do a self-assessment, you have to retain the evidence for at least 6 years. So your C3PAO will not retain the evidence for you. What's going to happen is they're going to assess all your evidence. You are going to store it in your system for 6 years, and you are going to hash every single piece of evidence and provide that list of hashes to the C3PAO. That is the only piece that the C3PAO will keep that has anything about your environment or evidence in at all. So basically at the end of the C3PAO assessment, your C3PAO will only have your assessment results and the hashed list of evidence, and that is it. So that way, it kind of limits the risk of a C3PAO being breached and having all this evidence from a bunch of different defense contractors. So that is why ultimately you are going to have to store the evidence. If you disagree with findings from your assessment with your C3PAO and you have additional evidence that can be used to prove that you are compliant, you have up to 10 days after your assessment is done to provide that additional evidence to make sure that you can close those gaps. Your assessor should be giving you updates throughout your assessment about whether or not you are trending towards meeting those controls. And that gives you more opportunity during the assessment to find evidence to close out those gaps. But you do have that 10-day grace period as well. There is no DIBCAC assessment at level 2. And some additional considerations: if you do not have a system security plan, it's an automatic failure. Whether it's a self-assessment or a C3PAO assessment, you need an SSP. You also cannot have draft documentation. So if you have policies and procedures that are in draft, don't provide them to your C3PAO. They will consider that a fail for documentation purposes as well. You need to make sure that everything is final, signed off, and approved as needed to meet your control requirements. And then the last consideration here, if you plan on getting level 3 at some point, you need to make sure that the level 3 scope is contained within your level 2 scope. They can be identical, or it can be a subset of your level 2. But if any part of your level 3 assessment sits outside of your level 2 scope, then DIBCAC cannot perform the assessment. They are going to rely on that level 2 assessment to confirm that the entire environment that your level 3 scope is contained in has already been assessed and met the requirements before they will do your assessment. So make sure that when you are scoping your environments, that whatever is going to be level 3 is also included in your level 2 assessment. So as I mentioned before, this will start to make more sense. So this is where you start to see the difference between level 1 and level 2. You can see here the yellow are the number of controls where POAMs are allowed, and the blue is where POAMs are not allowed. So there are a lot more controls. There's 22 different access controls, 13 of which can have POAMs, 9 for audit and accountability, 11 for identification and authentication. An important thing to note is that personnel security and system and information integrity do not allow any POAMs whatsoever. So you're going to want to make sure that you are definitely meeting at least all of the blue controls pictured here. The DoD assessment methodology will show you which controls are scored at 3 and 5, but you also can read the final rule to see exactly what controls are allowed to have POAMs, or you can reach out to Hive Systems and we'll help you understand which ones can and cannot be POAMs so you can prioritize those for your remediation purposes. And finally, we get to level 3. So level 3 is for that controlled and classified information that's more sensitive and has more APT considerations. So you've already got all of your level 2 controls, the 110 NIST 800 171 controls that are in place. This tacks on another 24 controls from NIST 800 172. You have to complete your level 2 assessment with a C3PAO first. And as I mentioned before, your level 3 assessment scope has to have been contained within that level 2 scope. And then every 3 years, you get your level 2 and then your DIBCAC assessment in order to maintain your level 3 certification. There is a scoping guide for level 3, but DoD CIO did not provide a assessment guide for level 3 because it is done by DIBCAC. There is no self-assessment option at level 3. So what is in scope here are your CUI assets. And the reason this has an asterisk here is because in level 2, do you remember those CRMAs, the ones where it could touch CUI, but by policy or configuration, you've made sure that it can't? Those are now CUI assets under level 3. So even if you were able to just document them in your SSP for level 2, you still have to have all of the 800, 171, and 172 controls in place on those assets, even if your policy says they cannot touch CUI. Because at level 3, they will be assessed as CUI assets. Your specialized assets are also in scope unless they are completely physically or logically isolated with no internet connection. And your security protection assets, again, are in scope. So those assets that process security protection data. The only assets that are not in scope are the ones that absolutely cannot process, store, or transmit CUI or assets that are completely physically or logically separated from your CUI environment. Same rules here for POAMs as level 2. You can have certain controls that allow POAMs. They do have to be remediated within 180 days. You have to do that POAM closeout assessment, and you do need to score 80% or higher to get that conditional certification. At level 3, DIBCAC is only going to look at those 24 800-172 controls because they're relying on the C3PIO assessment for the 800-171 controls. The only reason DIBCAC would even start poking around in your 800-171 controls is if they start finding that there are some red flags or things that don't seem to be implemented correctly when they're doing their assessment. So that 80% that I'm talking about for POAMs here is 80% of the 24 controls. You are already going to be expected to have a score of 110 with no open POAMs on your level 2 before you even get to this assessment with DIBCAC. Your SPURS inputs, again, is just your annual and every assessment attestation from your assessment official. So that's basically going to require them to go in every year, and then after the level 2 assessment and after the level 3 assessment and after any POAM closeout assessments that are done for either of those assessments, they're going to have to go in and affirm in SPURS. Your cloud service providers, same rules. They need to be FedRAMP moderate or equivalent, and the equivalency is on you to make sure that they're actually equivalent. If you have an external service provider, again, same rules, that you need to provide you with a customer responsibility matrix. They need to be thoroughly documented in your SSP, and they will be in scope for your assessment unless they are level 2 certified as well. DIBCAC may still look at those extra 24 controls, even if they are level 2 certified. The C3PIO assessment is already done as part of level 2, and DIBCAC, as I mentioned before, can perform some checks of the level 2 requirements if they feel it's necessary. And if they do find that any of your level 2 controls are actually not met, then your level 3 assessment could be paused or completely terminated. And if you have your level 2 certification revoked at any time, if you fall out of compliance and don't resolve it or anything like that, then it automatically revokes any level 3 certification you have as well. Same rules for the additional considerations. You need to have an SSP to even have an assessment, no draft documentation, and looking at that scope again, your level 3 assessment scope has to be contained within your level 2 assessment scope. And then these are the controls that are implemented here. Fewer controls, obviously there's 24, but only incident response, risk assessment, and system and information integrity have controls that cannot be POAM'd. So again, just really important to prioritize those 4, 5, 6, 7 controls to make sure that they are not missing, because if one of those is missing, it's an automatic failure of your level 3 assessment. You cannot POAM them. So now that we've done the deep dive, let's look ahead at what's coming in the future. I mentioned before, Rev 3 is published, but probably not going to be in effect for another couple of years. But if you're starting from scratch with your level 2, it's worth looking ahead at level 3 to see what controls you should implement that might change for level 3. For example, level 2 allows for either allow listing or deny listing, whereas revision 3 only allows for allow listing. So if you're going to have to pick one at level 2, pick the one that's also going to be applied for level 3, revision 3. So just little things like that that are important to look ahead at. There was some significant rework, as I mentioned before, for revision 3. So there's going to be organization-defined parameters probably coming from the DoD. There's going to be multiple subparts to the controls. But overall, it goes from 110 controls to 95. So as a whole, there's fewer controls, but a lot of them were just incorporated elsewhere. So there are only 14 entirely new control requirements for 800-171, and a lot of those are around supply chain risk management controls. There are a large number of controls that got new requirements as part of the control, but 27 controls were just incorporated elsewhere, so no real change there. And 7 controls were completely removed. So unfortunately, you do have to put them in place for revision 2, but they're not going to be required for revision 3. The class deviation that is currently in place for revision 2 is not going to last forever. As of right now, there is no termination date on that. And again, I do think it's going to be a couple of years before revision 3 comes into play. But another thing to consider is that there's a very limited number of C3PAOs in the marketplace. If you have to get a C3PAO assessment, it has to be from an authorized C3PAO that is listed on the Cyber AV marketplace. Anybody else who is claiming to be a C3PAO but is not on that marketplace is lying to you. So look at the C3PAOs that have already been authorized. I think as of right now, there's only maybe 53 companies that can even perform assessments for the multiple thousands of organizations that may have to meet level 2. And many of those have already started booking out into June of 2024 because there is such a small number of C3PAOs in the marketplace and so many companies that need a level 2 assessment. So if you know that you're going to have to get a level 2 certification assessment at some point, you should start talking to those C3PAOs now, because ultimately you want to get on their schedule. Even if it's not until November or December of next year, you want to secure your spot. Something to keep in mind, Hive Systems is in the process of becoming a certified third-party assessment organization. So we are hoping to be able to start providing certification assessments in March of 2025. If you're interested in learning more about that, you can reach out to us at Hive Systems. So that's all the time we have today. Thank you for joining us for our complete guide to CMMC. Hopefully, if you support CMMC compliance at your organization, this episode helped clarify some things, and be sure to share it with your team. If you're struggling to understand how exactly CMMC impacts your unique environment, want to know how ready you really are for a C3PAO assessment, or are looking for a C3PAO, our experts here at Hive Systems can help make sure you're ready to tackle any challenges. Please reach out anytime by visiting us at www.hivesystems.com. Before we go, make sure you subscribe to our channel so you can be alerted for our next episode by going to www.hivesystems.com/HiveLive. Next month, we will have another great episode, so make sure you don't miss it by subscribing to our channel at www.hivesystems.com/HiveLive.